Welcome to our deep dive, right into the middle of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You gave us this book, Palestine and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, A History with Documents by Charles D. Smith. And it's a lot. It's a dense book.
Yeah.
But it's perfect for what we're doing here, trying to understand this conflict, especially with what's been going on in Gaza.
It's really easy to just focus on the news and the headlines, but when you read a book like this, you realize this has been going on for so long. The goal today is to take all that history and connect it to what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to be looking at how history, religion, nationalism have all come together to create what we see today.
Yeah.
One thing that really jumped out at me was how Smith challenges some of the common ideas about the conflict, going all the way back to the ancient history of the region.
You know, a lot of people use the Bible to back up their claims to the land, but Smith brings in all this new archaeological evidence that challenges some of those stories, especially when it comes to the kingdoms of David and Solomon. It's interesting how these debates about history actually have a real impact on politics today.
It's like history itself is something people are fighting over. And then the book takes us through the time of the Ottomans and talks about all the different religious groups living together and how the idea of being Palestinians started to emerge. It made me rethink my own assumptions, because I used to think the Palestinian identity only came about as a response to Zionism.
And that's a really important point to understand. The book shows that Palestinians had a strong sense of their own identity even before Zionism became a big thing. Their identity was connected to the land they lived on. So it helps us see things from a different angle and understand their perspective better.
So just to make sure everyone's on the same page,
Right.
when we talk about Zionism, we're talking about the movement that wanted a Jewish homeland, which eventually led to the creation of Israel. And the book goes deep into the different reasons why early Zionist thinkers like Pinsker and Herzl believed in this idea.
And get this, Herzl, who wanted a Jewish state to escape persecution, he actually thought about places other than Palestine. Can you imagine that? He even considered Argentina. It changes our understanding because we usually think Palestine was always the only option for them.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how things could have been different if history had gone in a different direction. But okay, so moving on from the Ottomans and the rise of Zionism, we get to the time when the British were in charge, the British Mandate. And that's when things really start to heat up.
The book includes a lot of primary source documents from that time, and it's really powerful to read them. For example, the Balfour Declaration promised to support a Jewish national home in Palestine, but it also said they would protect the rights of the non-Jewish people living there already. When you read the actual words, you can see how those promises could be interpreted in different ways and how that led to problems.
Yeah, it's like trying to put a square block into a round hole. Those conflicting promises really set the stage for the conflict we're seeing today. And the book brings that to life by showing how the tension between the Arab and Jewish communities kept rising during that time.
Absolutely. And don't forget, the British were stuck in the middle. They were trying to juggle their own interests with the promises they made to both sides. It was a time of growing nationalism on both sides, which ultimately led to the 1948 war and the creation of Israel. And that, of course, has had a huge impact on everything that's happened since then, including the recent conflict in Gaza.
That leads us to one of the most important points the book makes. The 1948 war wasn't just some event in the past. It was a turning point that we're still feeling the effects of today.
Think about it. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced from their homes during that war. It's like a wound that hasn't healed. This displacement, the refugee issue, it's still a source of anger and resentment, and it shapes the demands of both sides, even now in the 21st century.
And it's not just a local issue either, right? The Cold War made everything even more complicated because the United States and the Soviet Union were both trying to gain influence in the region.
Yeah.
It was like throwing gasoline on a fire, and those international pressures are still having an impact today.
Exactly. The book goes into a lot of detail about those early years after 1948 when Israel was formed and there were all these debates happening within the country. We see this tension between people who wanted to find a way to live peacefully with their Arab neighbors and those who wanted to be more aggressive and expand their territory. And as you can imagine, these tensions had a ripple effect across the entire region.
So with all this history in mind, let's shift our focus to what happened after the 1973 war, which was another crucial moment in this conflict. The book talks about how the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, came to be, and how the idea of a peace process started to take shape.
And it's during this time that we see different forms of resistance emerge from the first Intifada in the late 1980s to the wave of suicide bombings that shook the region in the 1990s and early 2000s. These events, unfortunately, are deeply connected to the ongoing conflict and what we're seeing in Gaza right now.
It's really heartbreaking to see how this cycle of violence keeps repeating itself. And the book doesn't try to hide from the factors that have contributed to this standstill.
One key takeaway is that the very nature of the conflict has changed over time. The lines between state actors and non-state actors have become blurred. Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah are becoming more and more influential. To understand what's happening in Gaza right now, you have to understand what drives these groups and what they want to achieve.
And then there's the issue of settlements, which has become a major roadblock to any kind of progress. The book meticulously documents how Israeli settlements have spread in the occupied territories, and it examines the political reasons behind this expansion and how it's affected the peace process.
This expansion of settlements creates a new reality on the ground. It makes it harder and harder to imagine a two-state solution, which has been the main framework for peace negotiations for a long time.
It's like a constant tug of war between people who want to find a solution and those who seem to be pushing the two sides further apart with their actions.
And that's exactly the dynamic we see playing out in the recent Gaza conflict. Understanding the historical context helps us see how these seemingly impossible issues are actually deeply rooted in decades of conflict and mistrust.
It makes you realize that the path to peace in the Middle East is still long and uncertain. But by understanding the history of the conflict, by acknowledging the different perspectives, and by embracing the complexities of the situation, we can at least start to approach this difficult challenge with more wisdom and insight.
It's a journey that requires patience, perseverance, and a belief that a better future is possible. The book may not give us a clear roadmap to peace, but it gives us a valuable compass to guide us on this crucial journey.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes. It's clear that understanding history is absolutely crucial for navigating the present and thinking about the future of this conflict, especially as we try to make sense of what's happening in Gaza right now.
You know, one thing that often gets missed in all the news is like the human cost of all this. Smith doesn't just give us facts and figures. He tells stories that make this conflict real.
Yeah, that's true. It's easy to get caught up in the politics and the fighting, but in the end, it's people's lives that are being affected. The book introduces us to regular people, Palestinian refugees who want to go home, Israeli families who live with the threat of violence every day. It reminds us that there are real people behind the headlines, people who have experienced loss and hardship, but who also have this incredible resilience and hope for peace.
And that's exactly why understanding history is so important. It helps us look beyond the simple explanations and see the deeper reasons why this conflict is still going on today. Take, for example, how the peace process has evolved. The book covers all the major turning points, the Six-Day War, the Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords. But it does it in a way that shows us the different perspectives of both sides.
That really resonated with me. You see how both sides have different ideas about what victory and defeat mean, what justice means, and they both carry the weight of their own history, which shapes how they see the present and what they hope for the future.
It's a very complex story with threads of trauma displacement and this deep sense of loss. And those emotions are still very real, especially after what just happened in Gaza.
It reminds us that this isn't just some abstract political argument happening on a map. It's about real experiences that have shaped generations of people. The book also explores how those experiences have led to different forms of resistance, from peaceful protests to armed struggle.
And it's fascinating to see how the tactics and goals of groups like the PLO have changed over time, influenced by both internal factors and external pressures. Their story is crucial to understanding what's happening today, particularly the role of Hamas in Gaza.
Speaking of Hamas, the book sheds light on the rise of these non-state actors and their impact on the conflict. It's not as clear-cut as it used to be, and understanding these groups is key to grasping the complexity of the situation.
You're absolutely right. Hamas, for instance, controls Gaza and has been a major player in the recent conflict. The book helps us understand how they came to power, their beliefs, and their relationship with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It's a complicated story, and Smith does a great job of explaining it.
It's clear that this conflict is much more than just a simple fight between two groups. There are divisions within both Palestinian and Israeli societies, different factions with their own agendas and approaches. The book does a great job of showing this internal fragmentation, which adds another layer of complexity to the peace process.
Absolutely. And those internal divisions often spill over onto the regional and global stage. Remember, the Arab-Israeli conflict isn't just a local issue. It's been shaped by global powers, from empires to the Cold War.
The book really brings this complex geopolitical landscape to life. It shows how events in one country can have a ripple effect throughout the entire region and even influence global politics. And that's still true today. The recent conflict in Gaza drew international attention and sparked debates all over the world.
Exactly. The book's focus on the international dimension is especially relevant today. The roles of the United States, the European Union, and regional powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia continue to shape the conflict. Understanding these external pressures is key to any meaningful analysis of the situation.
It feels like a never-ending chess game with so many players and constantly changing alliances. But with this historical knowledge, we can at least start to understand the motivations and strategies of the different actors involved.
And that's what makes this book so valuable. It provides a framework for understanding not just what happened, but why it happened, and how it continues to shape the present. We can then connect those historical threads to the current situation in Gaza, the ongoing peace efforts, and the challenges that lie ahead.
So let's bring this back to the present. We've talked about the history, the conflict, the different narratives, the rise of non-state actors, and the complex geopolitical landscape. But where does that leave us today, especially after the recent conflict in Gaza? What are the biggest obstacles to peace?
Well, I think the book makes it clear that there's no easy answer. The obstacles are many and they're deeply rooted. The issues of land, Jerusalem, refugees, security, they're all connected and highly emotional. The recent Gaza conflict has brought all of these issues back to the forefront.
It's like the conflict itself has become this self-perpetuating cycle, fueled by historical grievances, mistrust, and the failure of past attempts at peace.
That's a really good way to put it. And that's why understanding the past is so important. It allows us to see that the present isn't inevitable. It's the result of choices and actions that were made over time. It also reminds us that to break this cycle of violence, there needs to be a fundamental shift in perspectives, a willingness to face uncomfortable truths, and a commitment to building a future based on empathy and understanding.
It's a daunting task. But as we come to the end of this deep dive, I'm left with a sense of cautious optimism. Despite all the challenges, there are people and organizations working hard to bridge the divides and create a more peaceful future.
And that's where the book ends on a hopeful note. It highlights the stories of peacemakers, activists, and ordinary people who refuse to give up hope. They choose to build bridges of understanding and empathy. Their efforts, even if they seem small, are a testament to the human spirit and the belief that a different future is possible.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still grow. So while we acknowledge the weight of history and the complexity of the present, let's also hold on to that glimmer of hope for a more peaceful and just future for everyone.
Absolutely. And remember, peace isn't just the absence of war. It's a process that requires constant effort, dialogue, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions and biases. This book gives us the knowledge and understanding we need to participate in that process more meaningfully.
Well said. This deep dive has been a powerful reminder that understanding the past is essential to navigating the present and shaping the future. We spent a lot of time talking about the history and the politics of this conflict, but I keep thinking about the people who are actually living through it. The book does a good job of showing us that personal side of things, and it really had an impact on me.
It's easy to get lost in all the talk about land and borders, but at the end of the day, this is about people and their lives, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Smith does a really good job of bringing that to life by sharing these personal stories.
I was especially moved by the stories of the Palestinian refugees. Their longing to go back to the homes they were forced to leave, the trauma that's been passed down through generations. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict, a cost that often gets buried under all the political noise.
Those stories are truly heartbreaking, but they also show us just how resilient people can be and how deeply connected they are to their land. And we also hear from Israelis who live with the constant threat of violence, the fear and uncertainty that they have to deal with every day. It reminds us that everyone involved in this conflict is affected by it, even if it's in different ways.
It's like the book is saying, hey, before you jump to conclusions, before you pick a side, just listen to the stories of the people who have actually lived through this. And then you'll start to understand how complicated it really is.
Exactly. It's about developing empathy and understanding, seeing the humanity in everyone involved. And that's where the book's discussion of religion comes in.
Oh, right. We don't often talk about the role of religion in this conflict, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity, don't you think?
Absolutely. Jerusalem, for example, is a holy city for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. That makes any discussion about its status incredibly sensitive and emotional. It's not just about politics and land, it's about deeply held beliefs and identities.
The book goes into how religious beliefs have been used to justify actions on both sides. It reminds us that this isn't just a fight for land. It's a fight for different versions of history and for the very soul of the region.
And that's why it's so important to understand the religious aspect of this conflict. It helps us understand why things are so emotionally charged and why it's so difficult to find a solution that respects everyone's sacred values.
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a lot of mixed feelings. Sadness for the suffering, frustration with the lack of progress, but also a tiny bit of hope.
I understand. The book doesn't shy away from the challenges, but even in the midst of all the darkness, it shines a light on the people who are working for a better future. We meet peacemakers, activists, artists, ordinary people who refuse to give up hope. They're choosing to build bridges of understanding and empathy.
Their stories remind us that change is possible even when things seem impossible. They show us the power of the human spirit to choose hope over hate, dialogue over violence, and a shared future over a divided past.
And that's what we hope you take away from this conversation. A deeper understanding of the history, a more nuanced view of the different perspectives, and an appreciation for the human stories at the heart of it all.
We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully this has given you a good starting point for learning more. This conflict is complicated, but if we want to see a lasting peace in the region, we have to be willing to engage with it thoughtfully and with empathy.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious to learn more.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep believing in the possibility of a better world.